June 4, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. As he disembarked from the ship Liberty, Unterscharführer Heinz Müller quietly remarked to his colleague behind him, "They must be pretending." In front of him, civilian workers, white and black, unloaded ships under the command of women in navy blue overalls. There were no barricades. There was no panic. There was not even silence. There was music. For a soldier trained in Reich doctrine, this was a staging, a safety error, perhaps a trap, but it wasn't. That vision was real, and it contradicted point by point what 3 years of German propaganda had established as truth about the American enemy. The thesis was clear. The United States, a divided, consumerist, and racially degenerate country, would never withstand a protracted war. This belief, widespread in Berlin military circles, would be dismantled, not by Patton's tanks but by the railroad yards. The factories lit up at night, the mess halls shared between soldiers and prisoners. This video reconstructs, step by step, what German POWs saw when they arrived in America. And like every banal detail, every free choice, every gesture of normality, it was eroding the foundations of the authoritarianism in which they believed. The war, for many of them, would end there, between donuts and cranes. But before we dive into the details, there's one statistic that defines this story and explains why so many German prisoners would never come back the same. In a single morning, the Norfolk Naval Base handled more cargo than the entire port of Hamburg in a week. All this under the coordination of civilians, with black and white workers sharing the shift. Cranes controlled by women and prisoners of war watching the operation, incredulous. In all, more than 425,000 Reich soldiers witnessed this country which, according to its generals, was to crumble under the weight of its own disorder. They expected to find a chaotic and fragile America. But what they saw was a nation where freedom produced more than fear, and where even the silence between shifts said more than speeches. If you value rigorous research and believe that history is made in forgotten details, support this channel. Your like, your subscription, and your comment keep alive the mission of revealing the facts that have turned enemies into witnesses of a new world order. The ship was still bobbing under the prisoners' feet when the landing ramp touched the Norfolk wharf. They were Wehrmacht men, captured in Tunisia, veterans of campaigns in Poland and France, trained on a doctrine that associated discipline with blind obedience and racial superiority with absolute control. But what they saw there, on the first morning on American soil, did not follow any military manual. The wharf was bustling with activity. Cranes turned with precision. Freight cars rolled along the internal railroad tracks. Civilian and military ships were fueled simultaneously. Civilian laborers, many of them black, operated heavy machinery side by side with white laborers. Women in uniform organized containers and distributed logistical forms with clipboards in hand. And in the midst of all this, street vendors offered coffee and donuts to anyone, including the prisoners themselves. That was not a scenario. It was every day. To the Germans, it seemed like a simulation, perhaps a propaganda staging to deceive them. But the efficiency was real. Every container docked, every crane synchronized with the supply line, every train positioned at the right time pointed to something deeper, a logistical gear that worked without terror. For German officers accustomed to production under whippings, this was more than strange. It was impossible. A Bavarian sergeant even asked, seriously, why the civilians had not been evacuated. No one understood the question. In the Germanic mentality, a naval base in the middle of the war, open to civilian circulation, was a breach of security. In America, it was Tuesday, and what most intrigued the prisoners was not the scale, but the environment. There was no neurotic hurry. There were no shouts of command. There was no tension in the air. It was as if a world war was raging on another continent, and yet that country seemed to be winning. They didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the physical manifestation of a concept that the Reich never understood: productivity through autonomy. The numbers were relentless. While Germany fielded about 3,000 military vehicles per month, the American industry produced more than 50,000 civilian automobiles in the same period, with part of the line adapted for war purposes. Norfolk alone handled about 600,000 tons of cargo a month, compared to 90,000 in Hamburg, at constant risk of bombing. It is at this point in the story that it is worth pausing. Many Nazi officials were ignorant of these figures, or they preferred not to believe it. But reality spoke louder. U.S. logistics production was up to 10 times higher than German in several industrial sectors during the height of the war. If this statistic surprises you, comment below with a short phrase like, absolute power, logistics wins, or simply, unbelievable. Your reaction shows that, like the prisoners themselves, you are also witnessing a lesser-told side of the war, and that was just the beginning. When the Germans were taken from the dock to the interior of the base, they thought that the situation would return to the familiar logic: isolation, silence, repression. But what they saw in the cafeteria, among trays and radios tuned to baseball games, was even more disconcerting, and for many, more devastating than any interrogation. The first steps in the Norfolk base mess hall were taken with suspicion. The prisoners expected what they had learned to expect: a degraded, guarded space where food would be rationed, human contact avoided, and humiliation used as an instrument of control. Instead, they found an organized, clean environment with electric lighting, aluminum trays, and the smell of fresh coffee. American soldiers and civilian workers ate quietly in one wing of the hall. The other wing, separated only by 20 yards of waxed floor, had been prepared for them. The food was the same. The portions are identical. The serving line operated accurately. And the cooks, Americans, many of them black, offered the food with professional neutrality. There was ambient music coming from a radio positioned in the background. The silence was not one of tension, but of normality. That dismantled more than expectations. It dismantled doctrines. Nazi ideology taught that power was sustained by physical domination, racial purity, and the humiliation of the enemy. But there, the prisoners, still in uniform, were treated as part of a functional process. There was no vengeance in the eyes of the Americans. There was a system. In an episode recorded by Red Cross inspections, and later cited in the memoirs of Unterscharführer Otto Weiss, a black sergeant in the U.S. Army was assigned to undergo incoming medical examinations, including blood pressure and blood draws. The procedure took place with clinical efficiency but caused embarrassment in the Germans. Some laughed nervously, others looked away. In Berlin, this kind of physical contact between races was not only condemned, it was forbidden by law. In the United States, it was a medical routine. One of the prisoners even whispered to another, "This is theater to break us." But it wasn't. America wasn't putting on a show. It was just being. The structure of the treatment offered was the result of administrative guidelines, not moral campaigning. The U.S. Army followed the Geneva Convention with operational zeal, reinforced by regular audits and the presence of international inspectors. But the effects, while unintended, were devastating to Nazi belief. Germany's ideological hierarchy was being inverted before our eyes, and without a single bullet. The Norfolk base at that time was already one of the most complex and efficient naval installations on the planet. It operated with the integration of different logistics fronts: rail, port, road, and air. The arrival of a convoy of prisoners did not interrupt her routine, it just fit into it. Every name was catalogued in fluent German, every medical record stored in standardized archives, every special need accurately communicated. Among the officers assigned to this process were American Jews. Their surnames, such as Goldstein and Rothman, were visible on the badges. These men, who by definition would be the target of persecution inside the Reich, were now on the other side of the drawing board, offering Red Cross packages and asking, in correct German, if any prisoners required kosher food. Most did not respond. Some laughed. They thought it was a provocation, but it wasn't. In one of the scenes most documented by Red Cross reports, a Jewish sergeant named Leonard Fish calmly explained that the U.S. military had prepared special meals for German Jewish prisoners, if they so desired. This logistical preparation required not only resources, but intention. And that meant that the United States had anticipated the arrival of enemies it refused to dehumanize. It was a strategic choice, but it was also a moral choice. The breach of logic worsened with every detail. The simple act of receiving immediate medical treatment with the same antibiotics used on American soldiers was reported by several prisoners as the breaking point. Penicillin, a scarce resource even in elite German hospitals, was applied there to captured combatants, many of whom were still dirty from the crossing. What seemed, to the German mentality, waste and weakness, was actually part of a technical protocol of high sanitary performance. The enemy was not spared by kindness. He was dealt with efficiently, and this distinction was even more corrosive. because it indicated that America didn't have to hate them to beat them. It only absorbed them as variables of a higher system. For the prisoners, that was not clemency. It was humiliation. A Luftwaffe officer, in a letter censored and later filed in the Red Cross records, wrote, "They treat us like men, but that's exactly what defeats us." American efficiency, underpinned by data, protocols, and a decentralized warfare infrastructure, did not need martial discipline to operate accurately. The rigidity of the Reich was replaced by productive flexibility, and the result was even more lethal. On average, the United States produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes on the Willow Run assembly lines, while Germany needed days to deliver a single elite fighter. This asymmetry was ignored by many German generals until their men, captured, returned with reports like this. But there was something even more disturbing ahead, something that no military manual had prepared to explain. The prisoner would be transported to the interior of the country, not in freight cars, not in closed trains, but in passenger trains, with upholstery, regular stops, and above all, full visibility. They were not being hidden. They were being seen. The crossing from Norfolk to the interior of the United States took 3 days. It was not done in freight cars, as the prisoners predicted, but on passenger trains, with padded seats, ventilation, and regular stops at civilian stations. The first of these stops, Union Station in Washington, D.C., offered Reich soldiers a scene none of them had anticipated. Hundreds of American civilians roaming freely on the platform, bidding farewell to family members embarking for the front. Children with flags, wives crying discreetly, enlisted soldiers carrying suitcases. 100 yards away, on the other side of the tracks, uniformed German officers observed the scene under minimal escort. There were no insults. There was no riot. There was indifference. And this indifference from the American public was not carelessness. It was security. The country saw no need to hide its prisoners, nor did he feel any threat to show them. That was, for many Germans, the first shock of what Butcher himself would call in his memoirs, the invisible arrogance of American liberty. Instead of secrecy, exposure. Instead of censorship, the radio turned on. As the trains continued their journey, the forced passengers had a direct view of entire industrial zones. Glenn L. Martin's Baltimore factories, which specialized in B-26 bombers, were operating at full steam with their yards full of civilian automobiles. The prisoners were able to count, literally with the parked aircraft. No attempt at camouflage, no visual blocking, no secrets. The names of the companies were stamped on the facades in huge letters. Across the Pennsylvania countryside, they saw coal mines operating in 3 shifts, furnaces burning that cast orange light on the night sky. Workers came and went in continuous cycles, wearing ordinary clothes, carrying lunch boxes, driving their own cars. There was no repression, and yet everything worked. A German officer, noting in his notebook the number of vehicles parked in front of a steel plant, remarked in a low voice, "This is not a war economy. That's an empire on the move." The trains continued to cut through medium-sized cities, suburban areas, mechanized agricultural zones. Everywhere displayed radio antennas on the rooftops, electric light in all the windows, constant movement of trucks. In Harrisburg, civilian workers watched the trains go by with casual curiosity, while eating apples or reading newspapers. One such scene was recorded in detail by Friedrich Müller, a prisoner of war in the German 15th Army. An American worker, on a break, discarded a bitten apple and took another intact from his lunchbox, a gesture that, to the Germans, symbolized the inconceivable waste of a country that seemed to operate outside the laws of scarcity. Abundance became a moral factor. While the Reich rationed soap and drinking water, Americans discarded food and still sustained a military production line that exceeded any German parameters. American logistics didn't just work, it was left over. And this excessive sobriety was beginning to undermine the technical pride of German engineers and officers. For a regime that staked its superiority on order, control, and centralized industrial efficiency, the vision of a society that was decentralized, plural, and disorganized at first glance, but brutally effective, was more corrosive than any interrogation. The American military secret was, paradoxically, to have no secret. Nothing was hidden, and yet nothing was vulnerable. The concept of force, for those captured men, began to reconfigure. They had been defeated not only by armored divisions, but by a national infrastructure that operated with the common citizen as an essential cog. When asked years later what moment marked his ideological surrender, Lieutenant Hans Koenig replied, "It was at that train station, not when they arrested me, but when I realized that no one was afraid of me." The real collapse was yet to come, and it would come not with tanks or planes, but with clean mattresses, indoor plumbing, and electric light in the middle of the prison camp, Camp Hearn, Texas. To captured Germans, the name sounded like a place of punishment. They expected isolation, minimal food, and cold barracks like the prison camps on the Eastern Front. But what they found was something that defied both military logic and Nazi morals. The barracks, made of solid wood, had glass windows, electric light in all rooms, and central heating. Each prisoner was given an individual mattress, clean sheets, 3 blankets, and a personal locker. The collective bathroom was equipped with hot water showers and flush toilets. The camp operated as a small functional neighborhood, with recreation halls, sports courts, a growing library, and even a band made up of the prisoners themselves. There were no chains, only fences. There was no forced silence, only regulations. And, most surprisingly, there was no culture of punishment. There was a system of functioning. Doctors in the infirmary gave penicillin to prisoners with field wounds, an antibiotic that was still inaccessible even to the Wehrmacht's elite hospitals. Red Cross inspections reported that the level of medical care at Camp Hearn surpassed that of German military units on the Eastern Front. The camp, unlike any German military prison, operated under the principle of maintaining basic welfare as a guarantee of order. This operating philosophy baffled the prisoners. In the Reich, order was imposed with coercion. In Hearn, it arose from the structure. Officers accustomed to exemplary punishment saw a system where discipline was maintained out of comfort, not fear. The camp chaplain ministered weekly services in German. Prisoners could write letters to their families and received answers. The library grew from 500 to more than 5,000 books in less than a year, with titles that included authors banned by Nazi censorship. Musical instruments were donated by citizens of the neighboring city. There were violins, clarinets, accordions. At night, some prisoners formed quartets. It was the sound of ideological disorientation. Because all of that, the electric light, the radio playing American music, the washed uniforms, the hot showers, wasn't theater. It was the daily life of a democracy at war that refused hatred as a policy. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The functional order that the Reich tried to achieve by force, the United States had already conquered by organization, and all this happened without the constant presence of armed guards, without shouting, without insults. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to bring these forgotten layers of history. In September 1943, prisoner Georg Gartner, with suspected appendicitis, was operated on in less than 4 hours, with complete anesthesia, by a surgeon of the American Army assisted by German nurses. Recovery occurred in a bed with a hospital mattress and special food. The operation, simple in the American structure, would have been fatal in the field hospitals of the Russian front. Efficiency there didn't come from technological superiority. It came from the ability to plan, build, and maintain. And it manifested itself not only in the production of weapons, but in the functioning of a human base. The monthly reports of the Swiss Red Cross confirmed the American camps not only met the requirements of the Geneva Convention, they exceeded them. An inspector summed it up in 1944. These prisoners live better here than many soldiers in combat. But the biggest rupture was yet to come, because contrary to what they learned in Reich manuals, these prisoners were about to discover that they could work and get paid. The first group of prisoners assigned to work at King Ranch in South Texas arrived in March 1944. They came prepared for forced labor. The instructions they received at Camp Hearn were vague: agricultural support under American supervision, and that to veterans of the Eastern Front sounded like a euphemism for corporal punishment. But when they landed in front of hundreds of hectares of cultivated land, they saw something that no war manual had predicted. There were no chains. There were no dogs. There were no fences. There were tractors. Tractors with wide tracks, enclosed cab, and American flag on the hood. Instead of hoes, they saw one-man-operated harvesters covering acres in minutes. Civilian planes flew over the plantation, coordinating irrigation operations and monitoring cattle with portable radios. One foreman explained, without arrogance, that agricultural system produced more cotton in a day than small German farms produced in weeks. The difference was not in the workforce, it was in the machines. and in the logic that sustained them. Prisoners were told to work 6 hours a day, with breaks every 2 hours, regular meals, and token payment deposited into their internal accounts, which could be used to buy cigarettes, soap, paper, and even magazines. When asked about the need for armed escorts, the administrator replied, "If you want to escape, good luck. The nearest town is 80 kilometers away, and we have a radio." None tried. The system did not need walls. It only needed confidence in the superiority of its own structure. King Ranch was more than a ranch. It was a showcase of productivity on a continental scale. Founded in 1853, it operated as a self-sufficient ecosystem. Internal fuel stations, machine shops, private airport, local radio, climate-controlled silos. The prisoners didn't just work there, they noted, and what they saw disconcerted them. American workers, many of them immigrants, discussed politics while on duty. One of them mocked President Roosevelt because of a recent speech. Another criticized the tax increase. A third, a middle-aged Texan, stated loud and clear that the generals didn't know what they were doing. The Germans waited for the arrival of the military police. It didn't come. No one was punished. No one has disappeared. The next day, everyone was back at their posts with coffee, newspaper, and radio on. This environment, where criticism was not punished, and yet did not cause collapse, contradicted everything that the soldiers of the Reich had learned about social organization. In the Nazi system, efficiency meant silence, fear, and hierarchy. In the American system, efficiency seemed to be born of conversation, experimentation, and the freedom to make mistakes. And to make the prisoners' mental confusion worse, the system worked better, much better. In absolute numbers, the United States, with less than 10% of the world's population, produced more than 40% of all agricultural machinery on the planet. A single Caterpillar D7 tractor, like the one they saw in the field, replaced more than 20 manual workers, and operated day and night. Cotton was harvested, packaged, transported, and sent by train, all within automated and decentralized logistics. Productivity there was not the result of military discipline. It was the result of human capital, technical freedom, and applied engineering. This exposure was not intentional, but it was fatal, because in the eyes of the prisoners, it showed that the American machine did not need repression to turn, and what disturbed them most was that that system, while allowing open criticism, operated with fewer failures, less waste, and less surveillance. A soldier in the 90th Panzer Division, identified as Dieter L., wrote in his notebook, "If someone said that a country that lets workers mock its leaders would win this war, I would laugh. Today, I don't laugh anymore." And he had not yet seen the most destructive of the American elements, the power of choice. Prisoners would then discover that, even while incarcerated, they could buy and decide. In the second month of rural labor, a new group of German prisoners was assigned to manual labor in the cotton fields near Kingsville, Texas. When they arrived, they noticed something even more challenging than the heat or the dust. They would work side by side with Black Americans and Mexicans, not in separate rows, not under military divisions, but on the same production line. It was something unacceptable for any Nazi doctrine, and not just because of racial mixing, but because, within hours, many prisoners were outperformed in productivity by workers who, according to the Reich's racial myth, should be inferior. Farm records show that the average daily harvest for a Mexican worker was 91 kilograms. That of a trained German, after 3 weeks of adaptation, was no more than 54. Black Americans harvested with technical efficiency, experience, and an informal system of cooperation. They laughed, exchanged tools, taught tricks, and reaped twice as much. The Germans, astonished, could not keep up. One prisoner, interrogated years later, stated that the greatest insult was not working with them, but being left behind by them. Most disconcerting, however, was the contrast between the treatment of prisoners and that reserved for local workers. The Germans could be captured enemies, but they were protected by the Geneva Convention. They had their rights formally assured. They received free medical care, balanced meals, clean accommodation, and even symbolic pay for the hour worked. American workers of color, born in the country, could not enter through the same gates. Black soldiers who served in the U.S. military, often in logistical roles, were forbidden to frequent the same restaurants as their German prisoners. A local coffee shop allowed Reich soldiers to enter, but did not serve coffee to African American soldiers in uniform. This asymmetry, as absurd as it may seem, was routine in the segregated South of the United States, and it did not go unnoticed by the prisoners. The paradox became untenable. Those who had learned that they were the vanguard of a master race now obeyed orders from black American sergeants, and they did so because these men demonstrated competence, organization, and technical mastery over their duties. Discipline came not from threat, but from royal authority. A black soldier explained the operation of an agricultural machine. The prisoners listened because they needed the knowledge. There was no room for racial pride when technical ignorance punished with real mistakes. This progressive exposure to the functionality of a diverse and unequal society, yet productive and stable, eroded the core of Nazi ideology. The equation that sustained the Reich, racial purity, efficiency, superiority, no longer made sense in the face of American reality. America segregated, yes. It was brutal, contradictory, and unequal, but he produced more, fought better, and won. The prisoners saw that, for all its flaws, the American liberal democratic system generated results that rationalized German authoritarianism could not match, and they began to internalize a dangerous truth. Perhaps freedom, even incomplete, even imperfect, worked better than imposed order. In a 1945 internal report, an OSS officer noted that the prolonged exposure of German prisoners to the contradictory workings of the United States provoked more ideological conversions than any pamphlet. And that was still just the beginning, because as they worked and learned, something even more unacceptable approached. The prisoners would be invited to study. December 1943. At Hearn Field, the winter was mild, but the emotional toll would be brutal. The German prisoners knew that Christmas was approaching. For many, it would be the first away from the homeland, with no news of their families, in a country that until months earlier was portrayed as a degenerate den of bankers, armed blacks, and Jewish conspirators. They expected indifference. At most, silence. But what came was incomprehensible. Volunteers from the nearby town organized a Christmas campaign for the prisoners. Children wrote cards in German with the help of teachers. Local churches rehearsed traditional Bavarian and Rhineland songs to perform outside the fences. American families sent packages with cookies, wine, cigars, and even photos of their homes, accompanied by messages wishing a peaceful Christmas, even among enemies. The guards reported dozens of prisoners crying silently after receiving the packages. There was roast turkey, there were apple pies, there were decorations in the tents. A Nazi soldier, a veteran of the French campaign, wrote, "They are not afraid to treat us well. It is not weakness. It is the confidence of the winners." This gesture of hospitality was not programmed by the high command. It was spontaneous, and it was all the more devastating for that. While Germany rationed soap and closed schools for lack of coal, the United States produced not only excess food, but also organized compassion. And this is where it is worth pausing with a number that the Germans simply refused to accept. In 1943, even in total war, the United States produced more than 40% of all manufactured goods on the planet, including machinery, vehicles, food, medicines, and consumer products, alone. If this surprises you, write here in the comments with a phrase like logistics wins, unbelievable, or absolute power. Their reaction helps to measure the impact of facts that still seem impossible today. The prisoners began to experience a cruel paradox. They were being treated too well by a country they had learned to hate, and this strategic kindness, this silent gesture of domination, began to function as a psychological weapon. Because what weakens a fanatic is not violence, it is contradiction. And on December 25, 1943, America exposed the greatest of all. She could feed her enemies while crushing their armies. But the real impact of this gesture was yet to come, because days later, these same prisoners would be invited to watch, to a class, about democracy, given by a Jewish teacher, American. In early 1944, records from Camp Hearn began to indicate an unexpected phenomenon. Prisoners disappeared, not by desperate escape but by a deliberate choice to blend in with the country that had captured them. Some were found weeks later on neighboring farms, wearing civilian clothes, working as day laborers or laborers. They were not trying to escape America, but to enter it. Subsequent interrogations revealed that many of these men did not seek to return to Germany. They wanted to remain where logic worked, where food was not rationed, where bosses discussed politics with employees and where life seemed possible even in times of war. One of the captured escapees, identified as Kurt H., stated without hesitation, to escape from the camp was not to escape from prison. It was trying to get into the system. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a decadent, divided society with no morals or purpose. But the prisoners had seen with their own eyes something far more dangerous, a system that, while chaotic, delivered results. In 1945, more than 5,000 prisoners voluntarily returned to Germany after the war, but taking with them books, notes, copies of American administrative regulations, and even technical manuals on production management. Many of these men would become, years later, mayors, engineers, teachers, and businessmen in West Germany, helping to rebuild a devastated nation. One of them, Hermann Weissmann, who had been captured in Tunisia, founded a logistics company along the lines of what he observed in the Texas railroad systems. Another, Friedrich R., asked the American occupation government for permission to study political science after undergoing an educational program within his own field. The American system had not beaten these men with bombs. It had won with organization, predictability, and choice. The most symbolic, however, were those who did not return. It is estimated that more than 10,000 German prisoners remained in the United States after the end of the war, through marriages to American citizens, asylum applications, or reapplication for immigration visas. They became citizens of the same country they swore to destroy. And they did not do it by imposition. They did it because they understood, perhaps before the Americans themselves, that the real strength of that nation lay not just in its cannons, but in its cafeteria, its train station, its library, its way of life. In a 1952 affidavit, filed by the State Department, former officer Hans Adler summarized, "We were captured by the guns, but it was their logic that disarmed us. It was the definitive turning point. The enemy was no longer an invader. It was a mirror, and many decided to cross it. But there was still a symbol of this silent transformation, a specific camp, lost on the American plains, that would become the most audacious experiment of invisible war, transforming Nazi prisoners in democracy teachers. From 1944 onwards, the corridors of Camp Hearn began to be occupied not by marching columns but by shelves. The internal libraries, previously limited to technical manuals and generic novels, began to receive entire boxes of books sent by American universities, churches, and even civilians. Works by authors banned by the Reich now circulated freely among the prisoners. Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, Erich Maria Remarque, Sigmund Freud, Stefan Zweig. For the first time, men trained to destroy ideas were being exposed to them, not as enemies, but as readers. And the most disconcerting, no one stopped them from thinking. The U.S. government authorized a pioneering initiative, coordinated by educators from Sam Houston College, offering classes in English, political history, economic geography, and even fundamentals of representative democracy within prison camps. Initially, many signed up out of boredom, others out of interest in obtaining advantages in the field. But little by little, what was curiosity became contagion. Classes were held in makeshift barracks, staffed by civilian professors, some war veterans, others university professors recruited by the War Department. The handouts included texts on the American Constitution, Lincoln's speeches, Roosevelt's New Deal, and even essays on the market economy. None of these ideas were imposed. All were offered. And that was the most effective strategy. War, at that point, was no longer just between armies. It was between worldviews. A prisoner identified as Otto K., a former engineering student in Dresden, wrote in a course essay, "I have been trained to associate freedom with disorder. But here, freedom seems to be what keeps everything standing." The impact was slow, but devastating. Men who had never read non-Aryan authors now discussed texts by Kafka and Spinoza in the classrooms of the countryside. OSS officers monitoring prisoners' behavior reported noticeable drops in the number of disciplinary incidents in camps, with greater access to educational activities. American power wasn't just in the engines, it was in the paragraphs. It was an invisible war, but deeply lethal to fanaticism. In 1945, one of the camps even offered introductory courses in journalism and public debate techniques. Prisoners learned to argue, question, defend opposing points of view. And once again, what disarmed them was not coercion but invitation. No guard pointed a gun to force them to think. What forced them was the contrast itself. How could a country that allowed so many voices function so efficiently? How did a choice-based system produce more cohesion than an obedience-based system? Nazi propaganda was beginning to crumble from within, because where there was censorship, now there was reading. Where there was a single discourse, there was now dialogue. Where there was fear, there was now analysis. On a visit by State Department representatives to the camp in January 1945, one of the officers remarked, "These men are slowly being converted, not by promises, but by proofs, and the results would soon be measurable." In surveys conducted at the end of the war, more than half of the prisoners who participated in the educational programs stated that their view of the United States had changed radically. 1/3 said that if they could, they would never return to the previous German system of government. The transformation did not come with gunshots. It came with pages, but the most audacious was yet to happen, because among those who were now reading about freedom, there was a group being trained to teach it. Even without knowing it, they would be the first teachers of German Reconstruction. In March 1945, as Europe burned under the last bombardments, German prisoners in Texas camps received fresh copies of American newspapers weekly, not censored versions or propaganda materials, but the same content distributed to civilians. There, on cheap paper and fresh ink, they read headlines openly attacking government decisions, editorialists questioning the cost of war, cartoonists depicting President Roosevelt with donkey ears or pig noses, being pushed by incompetent aides. A drawing in the New York Post showed a general trying to map the European front while slipping on a Washington soap, and no one was arrested for that. No printing plant was closed. No editor disappeared. For officers trained under Reich doctrine, where each newspaper was an arm of the propaganda ministry, this was more than confusing. It was dangerous. How could a nation at war allow such disorder and still function? How did the Supreme Military Command accept being satirized by nocturnal humorists while troops were dying on the beaches of the Pacific? And even more, how could this freedom not generate the collapse of the war machine? The explanation was where they least expected it. American democracy was not strong despite discord. It was strong because of it. The constant debate, the public criticism, the errors exposed in the open square, all these elements did not destroy the system. They refined it. With each scandal reported, a commission was formed. With each unpopular decision, protests arose and were heard. It was a noisy, often inconclusive but deeply functional process. And this was in direct contrast to the central narrative of the Third Reich, that unity, order, and silence were indispensable to victory. The prisoners read about Roosevelt being accused of overspending, about senators questioning the military strategy in Europe, about mayors facing the federal government over supply issues. And what did they see in the fields and on the roads? Trains arriving on time, factories operating in continuous shifts, civilians collaborating with blood donation, recycling, and war financing campaigns. Chaos, apparently, coexisted with efficiency, and this challenged the entire philosophical basis of National Socialism. Officer Werner J., captured in Tunisia, wrote in 1946, "In our world, doubt was treason. In theirs, the doubt was routine. And yet, they beat us." What was most impressive was not the freedom itself, but the ability of that freedom to sustain a gigantic productive machine. During the war years, the United States held full presidential elections, with debates, campaigns, fierce criticism, and policy changes, without delaying the production of a single tank. In 1944, while the Wehrmacht lost the front line in Normandy, the Americans manufactured 96,000 aircraft, and at the same time printed posters against the tax increase. The Germans watched, helplessly, the most divided country on the planet beat them on all axes: industrial, logistical, social, and moral. Authoritarianism had promised order and greatness, but the American disorder delivered results. And the more the prisoners watched, the more they understood. America's strength lay not in its military discipline, but in its ability to question everything and keep functioning. This perception would be the trigger for an even greater change, because the next step, bolder and more symbolic, would not be made by generals, but by a teacher with a chalkboard and a question that would change everything. What if you could vote? In the cafeteria of Camp Hearn, between wooden shelves and a worn glass counter, German prisoners lined up, not to take orders, but to choose. In the first weeks, the shock was silent. Each prisoner, after completing his workload in the camp's workshops or internal activities, received symbolic credits, an internal currency of the camp, based on the precepts of the Geneva Convention. With these credits, they could buy cigarettes, soaps, candy, magazines, chess sets, and, for the more daring, even musical instruments. The canteen operated with a supervised self-service system. There were index cards, catalogs, and even handwritten suggestions such as "Try Virginia Tobacco," or "The new edition of the Saturday Evening Post has arrived." The effect was subtle but profound. For the first time in their lives, many of these men could decide what to consume, and when, without a superior, without a party rule, without authorization from the state, only based on desire, taste, or impulse. It was just a canteen, but it functioned as a philosophical revolution. For soldiers brought up under totalitarianism, where every need was mediated by the state machine, the simple act of choosing between two flavors of gum became an unexpected exercise in autonomy, and it was addictive. Within a few months, many of the prisoners were managing their finances carefully. They kept credits, made exchanges, arranged collective purchases. They began to operate unconsciously within the logic of free consumption, and more than that, they began to desire. A field report describes the case of an SS prisoner who, after refusing any interaction with the canteen for weeks, was seen exchanging 2 packs of cigarettes for a copy of Hemingway. The guard noted in the report, "Doctrinal resistance overcome by chocolate and literature." But the depth of the impact went beyond consumption. The prisoners themselves managed part of the internal logistics of the canteen, from stocks to spreadsheets. They learned basic principles of accounting, distribution, negotiation, and they did so in a system that, according to Nazi manuals, should have collapsed without censorship or surveillance. Nothing collapsed. Backwards, the system evolved with participation. And it is at this point that a factual fact sums up the abyss that separated them from the German reality. In 1944, even in the middle of the war, the United States produced 75% of all the chocolate traded in the world. Yes, 3/4 of all global production, while Germany confiscated food and rationed soap. If this surprises you, comment with a phrase like "logistics wins," "absolute power," or "unbelievable." Because it is in this absurd contrast between total war and functional abundance that the Nazi doctrine begins to crumble. By allowing choices, the American system didn't just offer comfort, it offered freedom, and that freedom seeped into the small routines with a force that not even the steel of a panzer could contain. When a prisoner chose between 2 soaps, he wasn't just cleaning his body, it was clearing layers of automatic obedience, of racial indoctrination, of conditioned reflexes. I was, without knowing it, experiencing the most dangerous idea in the world for any totalitarian regime, that the individual can, and should, decide for himself. But this was only one of the tools of deprogramming, because the next step would be even more symbolic, allowing prisoners not only to buy, but build, with hammers, with pencil, with freedom. On a monitored tour of International Harvester's industrial plant in Kansas, a group of German prisoners were led through hallways where steel boiled and engines roared, not under whips, but under electric light, fans, and voices in normal tones. The ranks of workers did not wear standardized uniforms, did not salute the supervisor, did not march between sectors, and even then, or because of it, each section functioned with a precision that dismantled any theory of racial supremacy. The person in charge of the assembly line was a Polish immigrant. The leader of the quality control sector was a 38-year-old African-American woman. The engineer who explained the operation of diesel valves had been born in Mexico, and all, without exception, worked at a faster pace than the Krupp or IG Farben factories, even without threats, punishments, or ideological slogans. For Wehrmacht officers, the impact was physical. They couldn't hide their embarrassment. That was not just an operational affront. It was a moral humiliation, because what they saw there in the sweaty faces and smiles among colleagues was productivity with dignity, a combination that the Reich declared impossible. One of them, according to an account recorded by an American colonel, murmured, "In Germany, this man would be silent. Here he commands a line." The most devastating thing was to find that those workers, in theory inferior according to the Nuremberg doctrine, not only produced more but also produced better. The error rate in harvester parts was lower than that of the German arms industry, even under the terror of Nazi supervisors. And when asked about their functions, the Americans did not mention the Führer nor the state. They said, "I do my best because I can." To men trained on the idea that duty is born of imposition, this kind of response was incomprehensible. Even more so was the surrounding environment. Stocked canteens, break rooms, radios playing jazz, workers discussing politics during breaks and returning to work with redoubled efficiency. In an internal U.S. intelligence report, an observer described the look of a German captain when he saw a black woman coordinating the calibration of a precision lathe. He looked not with anger, but with confusion. The image tore through his mental map. According to the ideology he defended, that woman should be silenced, marginalized, or subjugated. Instead, she controlled a process that fed tanks and battleships, and no one there seemed to find it strange. Worse, everyone respected her. This inversion reached the core of the German racial hierarchy, because it was not an exception. It was the rule. The American productive force was not white, nor homogeneous, nor militarized. It was multiple, voluntary, and noisy, and that made it faster. In 1944, the average American worker delivered 2.5 times more finished product per hour than the average German worker, even with higher wages, shorter working hours, and greater autonomy. If this number impresses you, register your reaction in the comments with phrases such as shocking data, logistics wins, or absolute power. For it was precisely these data, ignored by generals, omitted by propagandists, that shook the conviction of thousands of German soldiers. The idea that fear was the only engine of production had crumbled in the face of something simpler. Well-managed freedom produces more than terror. Prisoners were beginning to realize that they had been defeated not only by the American war machine, but by something quieter and more ruthless, a system where even the weak had a voice. And that voice, he built the impossible. But there was still a vision that would bury once and for all the belief in the invincibility of the Reich. It would not come from a factory, nor from a field. It would come from heaven, and it would explode as a technological revelation impossible to ignore. When prisoner Heinz K., a former Wehrmacht artillery officer, wrote in his diary that, "What you see here is not a country, it is a plan for the 21st century," he was not making a metaphor. He watched. Like so many others captured and scattered across the camps of Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi, Heinz had spent months absorbing what the Reich's instructional books did not mention: a democracy that functioned not in spite of chaos but through it, an economy that grew while its citizens questioned the government, an army that allowed humor, error, and improvisation, and yet crushed its enemies. By this point in the war, the prisoners were no longer just talking about the conflict. They began to talk about what would come next, and what they saw around them seemed not just the momentary strength of a military power, but the outline of a civilization designed to last. In the courses offered inside the camps, prisoners learned about the U.S. Constitution, about civil rights, about the checks and balances of a system that avoided the accumulation of absolute power. They learned, for example, that a president could be criticized, challenged, judged, and still re-elected by popular decision, that laws could be changed by social pressure, by vote, by debate, and that machines were not more important than principles. While the Third Reich burned its books to protect its myths, Americans distributed their own, even to their enemies. It was an almost arrogant confidence, and a fully functional one. The trains continued to arrive on time, the factories operating in 3 shifts, the cities to vote, the ideas circulating. In the minds of many prisoners, the comparison was no longer between armies. It was between centuries. Europe, which had produced empires, cathedrals, and millennial wars, was now in ruins. Germany, which had promised 1,000 years of glory, imploded in a few 12. America, which many ridiculed for its youth, immaturity, and political noise, was beginning to reveal itself as the true heir to modernity. Not the modernity of trenches or military parades, but that of infrastructure, continuous electricity, paved roads, railway networks, mass distribution, popular culture, autonomous production, decentralized citizenship. For one prisoner recently transferred from France, the shock came when he was allowed to attend evening math and English classes with local volunteers, alongside poor young Americans who used the same books, learned the same contents, and left the same classrooms to work in. Fields and bakeries. It was the same system for everyone, The son of the Polish immigrant was studying with the captured Nazi in El Alamein, and both were treated, in that room, as men in training. It was unthinkable, and it was symbolic, because America's real project, in the eyes of those who hated it, was not to defeat an army. It was becoming inevitable. In 1944, as the Luftwaffe melted down its last aluminum planes, the United States was building 24,000 locomotives, paving more than 35,000 kilometers of interstate roads, and founding 75 new technical universities, many of them open to veterans and then to immigrants, in the middle of the war. When the prisoners saw this, they understood what their generals had not anticipated. That superiority would come not from weapons, but from scale, not of discipline, but of freedom, not of purity, but of complexity, not of the past, but of the future, and the future had an American accent. One of the Red Cross reports, after a visit to Camp Swift, recorded the following conversation between two captured officers. "If we lose this war, and we will, it will be for a simple reason. They built something that doesn't have to win through fear." It was the point at which the war, for many of these men, was already lost, even before the ceasefire. But America still had one last lesson in store, a weapon that was not seen in ports or fields. She was in the warehouses, on the docks, and in the numbers, and it was as devastating as a bomb, because it was made of boxes, ships, and time. They arrived as soldiers of order, trained in the harshness of the barracks, indoctrinated in the binary logic of obedience or punishment, sent to defend an empire that thought it was eternal. But they left, years later, as living witnesses of another kind of force, and more than that, as involuntary carriers of an invisible seed. Because unlike the formal post-war denazification projects, the real transformation of prisoners began before surrender, inside American camps. Not in interrogation rooms, but in the communal kitchens. Not in the speeches, but in the shared lunches. Not in the courts, but in the small daily gestures that, as they accumulated, accomplished an almost chemical feat, the slow and profound dissolution of an ideology. In 1951, a study conducted by the West German government identified that approximately 70% of former prisoners of war who had passed through camps in the United States adopted democratic positions in their civilian life. Many joined moderate parties, created unions, promoted educational reforms. Some became mayors, deputies, judges, teachers, and all in their memoirs recounted the same experience. They were not convinced. They were exposed. And what they saw, heard, ate, read, and felt, it could no longer be undone. It was like a new lens. Reich propaganda said that democracy was weakness, but in the American fields it proved resilient. He said that freedom generated chaos, but there it generated efficiency. He said that the people were dangerous, but there people built ships in 3 shifts, and even made jokes at lunch. Ideology was not overthrown with arguments. It was replaced by coexistence. The transformation was not theoretical. It was sensory. It started with the smell of scented soap, in the taste of bread without rationing, to the sound of a radio that played jazz and not military marches, in the right to disagree without disappearing. And it continued in the books, in the laughter, in the repeated experience of a society that functioned without fear. Prisoners who lived at Camp Ruston, Camp Hearn, and Fort Robinson reported recurring dreams after returning to Germany. They dreamed of the clean barracks, the baseball games, the debates about journalism, the meals with guards who knew their names. And when they woke up, they missed it, because, unexpectedly, captivity had become freer than youth under Nazism, and it marked them at a level that weapons couldn't reach. It was a war of systems, and the senses had won. The result was a generation that rebuilt Germany not with nostalgia for the past, but with a new map, and this map originated in the American fields. The great irony of the story is that the solution was in front of them from the first landing. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts hidden under layers of propaganda, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to reveal the invisible gears that change the world. Because the next revelation goes beyond statistics. It is a symbol, a gesture that took place inside a camp in Texas and that years later would appear in NATO documents. The enemy has not only transformed, he helped design the new world. Decades have passed since the watchtowers were dismantled, the wire gates were taken down, and the barracks quietly demolished. But for thousands of former German POWs, The camps of the United States never ceased to exist. They persisted, not as a prison, but as a reminder of a shock of reality that became the foundation of freedom. From the 1950s onwards, letters began to arrive at the American consulates in Germany, asking for no visas or reparations, only thanks. They were written by men who had gone through war, capture, disorientation, and for transformation. Some sent old photographs of the camps. Others contained hand-drawn Christmas cards with messages addressed to guards, teachers, nurses, even base cooks. One wrote, "That winter, a prisoner in a country that was supposed to hate me, I received the first chocolate cake of my life. I never forgot the flavor. It was more than sugar. It was the taste of humanity." Over the years, dozens of former prisoners have returned to the U.S. and not as defeated soldiers, but as thrilled tourists. They visited churches where they had sung German hymns alongside Americans. They looked for the cemeteries where comrades who died of diseases were buried, far from the battle but surrounded by respect. One of them laid flowers at a monument in a small museum in Arkansas and left a note with only one sentence. "Here I learned that freedom is not shouted." He offers himself. The bond between enemies has become a bridge between civilizations. American families who had adopted prisoners for community work received letters for decades. Some were invited to weddings in Germany. Others, visited by grandchildren of soldiers who had once been captured. History was rewritten in small memories, in details forgotten by official historiography. And the most symbolic thing was the way many of these former prisoners began to refer to their time in captivity. "They were the first days of my freedom." The contradiction was brutal. The prison that freed, the exile he taught, the defeat he built. To someone who had sworn allegiance to the Reich, singing jazz in a Texan chapel seemed, at first glance, surrender, but it turned out to be a new beginning. This effective legacy has shaped not only personal trajectories, but the very way the West has reconciled. When, in the 1980s, a former prisoner spoke at an educational congress in Bavaria, he said, "I did not learn democracy from pamphlets. I learned by watching a black man teach me math." The audience stood up. The lasting peace was not signed at Yalta. It was built between breads, classes, and small choices. But there was still one question, uncomfortable and unavoidable, that needed to be answered. If freedom worked even for enemies, why does it scare its allies so much? And it was time to look not at the prisoners, but at those who freed them. What German POWs witnessed in the U.S. camps could not be learned from military manuals, nor reproduced by fiat. It was not a trainable doctrine, like Prussian discipline, nor an ideological formula, like Nazi totalitarianism. It was a way of life, a social architecture made of disagreement, of multiple voices, of open and imperfect spaces. In the eyes of those who grew up under the weight of vertical authority and institutionalized fear, American democracy seemed, at first, disorganized. He seemed vulnerable. But the more time they spent inside it, even as prisoners, the more they realized that the chaotic appearance was actually the sign of a strong internal structure, a silent force, which dispensed with symbols of terror, that it didn't need gears, that did not require unanimity, and that even so produced more, fed more, coordinated more, and won, because it was lived, not taught. There was no explicit re-education program there. There was no formal policy of ideological conversion. American freedom was not explained. It was displayed accidentally. It appeared in the sound of a criticism of the president on the radio, in the newspaper that arrived at the field before lunch, in the debate between two guards about the future of war, in laughter and boredom and variety. The power of democracy was not in his certainties. It was in his ability to contain contradictions without collapsing, to keep the production even under criticism, to grow up under conflict. For the German prisoners, the paradox was unbearable at first. How was it possible to have a society where the citizen could mock the army, and yet the ships arrived on time, where the worker could strike, and yet the factories broke records, where the government could be hated, and yet he was re-elected? The American system did not impose itself. He expressed himself, and that's why it infiltrated. Therefore, it undermined certainties. Therefore, he planted doubts. The greatest threat the United States posed to the Third Reich was not its weaponry. It was its lack of fear, and more, his indifference to what, for the Germans, was sacred: the uniform, the command, the hierarchy. In the camps, prisoners saw low-ranking soldiers disagree with officers without being punished. They saw young civilians question retired generals. They have even seen American children themselves challenge adults in public meetings. It was not anarchy. It was a balance that authoritarianism would never understand. Because while the Reich needed to control everything to function, the U.S. prospered by letting go. Each argument was a motor. Every mistake, a lesson. Each voice, a part of the gear. And this gear produced more than steel. It produced change. The prisoners arrived expecting to meet the enemy. They discovered the future, and the future didn't wear boots. It wore ideas. But there was one last camp. One that has never been recorded on maps. One that symbolized the apex of the contradiction experienced by the Germans. A field where there were no fences, but where the final conversion took place. Because there, it was no longer about survival. It was a matter of choice. And the choice in that place would change the history of dozens of cities in Europe. They were not overcome by bombs. They were won over by open supermarkets, by schools with light, by uncensored radios. And perhaps the most disconcerting part of the story is this. The soldiers of the Third Reich, indoctrinated to despise everything democratic, were demobilized for what they despised: freedom. And not just any rhetorical freedom, but a concrete, everyday freedom, made up of choices, voices, noises. What these prisoners found in America was not just an unexpected enemy. It was an inverted mirror, a country where disagreement generated progress, where criticism fed cohesion, where the common citizen, poor, black, woman, foreigner, could still produce, create, survive, and dream. They expected to find disorganization. They found a working machine, fueled by debate. They expected to see weakness. They become power, and they didn't know how to appoint it. The narrator then turns to the viewer, because this story is no longer just about soldiers, about 1943, about camps. It's about you. Because what they saw, the inverted logic, the power disguised as chaos, the triumph of humanity over brutality, you would see it too. You would also disarm. He would also feel confusion. He would also be silent in front of a dinner served by those who should hate him. So, the question that hovers, invisible but inevitable, whether American democracy, imperfect, noisy, disorganized, has managed to demobilize fanaticism with structure, respect, and routine. What is this same logic capable of doing today? In times when new forms of tyranny are reborn in more subtle garments, control by fear, disguised censorship, cult of authority, do we still have this invisible weapon in our hands? And more importantly, are we willing to use it? Because the force that defeated the soldiers of the Reich was not in the rifles. I was in the cafeteria, in the library, in the newspaper, in the right to say no. The story seemed about the past, but now it's about the present. And in the next part, when the last prisoner returns to Germany and reveals what he saw, what he felt, and what he could not forget, the answer begins to form. The defeat of the Third Reich was not only consolidated on battlefields or on the beaches of Normandy. It began to crumble quietly in filled beds in clean cafeterias, in classrooms set up in the heart of Texas. There, where the enemy was to be broken by isolation, it was disarmed by coexistence. While the German doctrine bet on steel, obedience, and purity, the American model exposed a power that totalitarianism could not combat: organized freedom, productive chaos, generosity with method. When the prisoners returned to Germany, they did not return as they were. They took with them more than souvenirs. They carried an invisible system. A symbolic battlefield had won where cannons had failed. The U.S. didn't just defeat the German army. They defeated his imagination. And with that, they collapsed their ideological core. The biggest lesson of this war was not about tanks, fighter jets, or military figures. It was about moral logistics, about how abundance, efficiency, and freedom, combined, crush authoritarianism without having to imitate it. Strategy wins battles, but it is logistics that sustains victories. America did not defeat Nazism with slogans. He won with punctual trains, hot food, and small choices that became bigger weapons than any bomb. As General Dietrich von Koltitz, commander of the Paris garrison, confessed, "We were defeated by trucks, by factories that did not sleep, and for ideas that we cannot destroy." If you value this type of research and want to see more hidden truths of history being brought to light, Leave the like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Comment below. What was the most shocking data for you in this video? What surprised you most about the ideological fall of the Reich? Because history is still alive, and it needs someone to keep it moving. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.